There are some people that you can just sit down to and start a conversation. Next thing you know, it's 2 hours later, and you never got to talk about what you wanted to talk about, and yet you've had one of the best conversations ever. Well, today on Life Talks, I've brought somebody in that is that way with me. Jason Lanier, who is the worship pastor at Life Fellowship here in Charlotte, is our guest. Jason, thanks for coming in and being part of this. This is not Jason's very favorite thing to do. Nope. I want everybody to know this.
We dragged him in here.
Dragged him in here on purpose.
But he's deeply
I would say literally,
right
but
now.
I don't like the misuse of the word literally.
You see, this is why the man is so fascinating. We're going to parse words. We're going to make sure definitions are accurate today. But my name is Dan. I'm one of the teaching pastors at Life Fellowship in suburban Charlotte, North Carolina. We're joined today with Jason and also our producer, Josh Brom, who's the president and founder of the Equal Rights Institute. And today we're going to have a freewheeling conversation, Jason, so you don't feel any stress. There are no pre-designed talking points.
Just good dialogue, good conversation.
Good conversation. And folks in their cars and on their treadmills and taking their walks with their dogs.
We'll leave the burden of titling it to Josh.
Well, yeah, he can figure out what we talked about when we're done talking about it. But
he don't listen to my titles.
You're listening into a conversation among friends. But here's one of the things, Jason, I find so fascinating about you is often there is a philosophy that drives you on just about everything you do, whether it's parenting or it's leadership or it's training or it's leading the congregation in worship or designing a worship service. All of these, you are a thoughtful minister. You're a thoughtful leader. And often what we do is we use models we've seen without understanding the reason behind the models, and we just regurgitate generation after generation of copying. But you move beyond that. And so that's kind of what today I want to kind of start off with just the concept of worship in churches today. And we're not specifically referencing Life Fellowship, but Life Fellowship is our point of reference. But there's, in the course of your ministry, and certainly in the course of mine, there's been a lot of changes.
Yes, yeah, for sure. I mean, to say the least. I've been in ministry for 30 years this year, and in music ministry, and I cannot tell you the number of articulation points from style to style, technology change to technology change that I've experienced in just 30 years. It's been
so you mentioned two things. You mentioned style, because that has been a shift.
Yeah.
Technology has affected.
Infected and affected.
Yeah. The way that we approach worship.
Before we knew AI.
Yeah. And it's going to increase. It's going to get more so. One of the things I love about you, Jason, though, is you have a way of articulating the design, the plan, the philosophy. When asked, you don't wear it on your sleeve, but it's intentional. In today's culture, where we've seen all of these changes in technology and in preferences and in the culture and so forth, you're often kind of like on the front line. You get the criticisms, you get the questions, you get the suggestions on a weekly basis. Isn't that kind of part of your life?
Yes. Yeah. For all 30 years, yes. Yeah. And in the beginning of those 30 years, I just accepted that as, I can't think of the word I would give it, but just it is as it should be. It's only been in the last, I would say maybe the last 6 to 7 years that it all of a sudden dawned on me that is there an example within Scripture and the ancient church of any guidance at all of how we should approach God in worship? And that's how I stumbled upon, these academic words of doxology and liturgy. And I discovered, it isn't just our preferences. Yeah, but for I'd say the first 23 years of my 30 years of ministry, I felt like worship as a synonym for just music, which I've also learned is inaccurate, which is based upon cultural relevance and individual preference.
Which that kind of puts us in the role of consumers, wanting an experience that meets our expectations and likes and dislikes. So let's back up a little bit. Let's unpack a little bit. What do you mean when you use a word like liturgy? And what do you use when you use a word like doxology? And what are the origins of those terms?
I thought you might ask that, and I've struggled with coming up with an answer for it. But I would say that liturgy and doxology, I'm a recent student to them. I would say that they are basically the framework within which you learn to relate to another human being. And in the ecclesiastical setting, which is our fancy word for church, you're talking about relating to God. So I know when I go home today, there is let's use liturgy. Mm-hmm. There is a liturgy that I should observe when approaching my wife. I shouldn't just burst through the door and say, "What's for dinner?" Like we can do in our Sunday services. We burst through God's presence and we sing, I don't know, I can't think. The song that comes to my mind right now is "I Ran Out of That Grave," which I think 90% of Western church Americans don't know what that means, to run out of a grave. So liturgy is basically the framework within which I learn to have a dialogue with another being that meets their expectations and their needs, that is also productive for the two of us. So worship is conversation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we worship, it's a conversation we have with God, whether that's through prayer, singing, reflective thought, and we know in Genesis, which it's kind of a I wish I had discovered this earlier in my life, but in Genesis we learned that there was an approach to God by Cain and there was an approach to God by Abel. Mm-hmm. God clearly preferred one over the other. Mm-hmm. So God has a way in which he wants us to approach him. I have a way in which I want you to approach me. Mm-hmm. You have a way in which you want me to approach you. Mm-hmm. We just watched, the inauguration yesterday. There's a way in which we approach the formality of, installing a new president. Mm-hmm. And that's what liturgy and doxology is.
So they're not bad words.
No, but I think that they're foreign words to the modern church. And so we tend to think of foreign and unfamiliar as bad.
Yeah.
Foreign and unfamiliar, to me, is an invitation to learn.
Which is one of the reasons why I think it's important we talk about it, because it is a driving factor in leadership in a church setting toward worship. In other words, when you understand that there's an intentional...
Worship being, again, that really deep theological word that we would call just simply relating to, conversing with God. If we were to retranslate the Bible, maybe like the Message, even though I know that some people, I don't read the Message, don't send Dan a bunch of emails unless you just want to, but just use words that are about relationship. Mm-hmm. Worship is the way in which I interact with God. Mm-hmm. Yeah, liturgy is the way in which I approach God.
And one of the things God teaches us is that he is approachable.
He is approachable.
Right.
Yeah, because he approached us first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He made us.
Yeah. So, a lot of times, and I grew up this way, when we would use words like liturgy, doxology, we immediately stereotyped
Catholic,
yeah. Formalism, deadness, because old, yeah, ancient, yeah,
duty versus devotion, yeah, unfeeling,
yeah. So
stoic,
which is why stoic's a great word. Which is why we need a new word for it.
Yeah. I was going to say, how do we recapture the intention without becoming mired in the negative connotations that go along with the terms?
Yeah. I think liturgy is, I look at Christmas, as a family. I look at the Christmases I loved as a child, and I try to recapture that moment as a child during a very nostalgic, very enjoyable moment in my life. So then I begin to codify it and I turn it into tradition. Mm-hmm. So now my children's Christmases are a form of my Christmases as a child. And that's kind of, I think, the intent of liturgy is to codify good intentions and authentic, healthy experiences.
You mentioned the word tradition, and I want to stop there because I think it gets a bad rap at times. Whether Fiddler on the Roof, where he's singing tradition, where it can become suffocating. I guess if you live in a culture that worships tradition,
it becomes sunrise, sunset. Also from Fiddler on the Roof.
Yes, absolutely. That was sung at my parents' wedding. Just a little piece of
sunrise,
trivia.
Sunset was sung
at my parents' wedding.
Oh wow, that was romantic.
Yeah, it was very much so. But when it comes down to it, tradition's also very healthy. It provides touchstones, milestones. It connects us to the past and to heritage. How do we keep a right balance toward tradition?
That's a great question. I think part of it is to understand that potentially tradition's intention is to convey knowledge. So I love to walk.
Mm-hmm.
I love gardening.
Mm-hmm.
So when I see a seed, for example, whether it's a tomato seed or a pepper seed, within that seed is actually tradition. Within that seed is the code to produce another pepper plant, is the code to produce another tomato plant. If the tomato plant suddenly decided to break from tradition,
become a watermelon.
It would become a chicken or a watermelon, right? It'd be like, that is not what I intended to plant. So again, tradition is a codifying, and the word itself becomes so cold to the point that it loses its meaning. But I think the intention behind tradition is to consistently and sustainably transfer what we believe to be good, virtuous, valuable knowledge from generation to generation to generation, to continue to tell the same story. You and I are here today because there are several men and women who successfully lived on planet Earth that led to the conception of you and I. We are the tradition of successful, at the very the basic biological basis, successful men and women. That's tradition. So I think liturgy is an attempt. It's a religious attempt to codify tradition, and to get out of this whole particular. Just to say, the gospel of God is a singular story. We should not be remaking our worship services every single generation. Moses is as relevant to us today as we are to Moses. Like, Moses is not more relevant than we are. Like, we're a part of that exact same story. Adam and Eve, I personally believe they're aware of us, just as we're aware of them. So we're continuing the tradition, we're continuing the story, if you will, through our Bible study, our prayers, our worship.
And I love that, because that's referred to as a meta-narrative. It is the overarching story, and really the gospel, the story of mankind is God's story, His story, and it began at the garden, and it continues. We know generally how it ends. We don't have all the details and specificity, but we know the Scripture tells us where we're heading, and we are one of the chapters or one of the lines in a chapter in that book that we're living out. But we don't stand in isolation from those others.
Which is why the church gathers just like our families gather. And when I get going back to Christmas, when my family gets together at Christmas, guess what we retell? We retell the family stories.
Absolutely.
And when the church gathers, the Scriptures are pretty clear on this. We are to retell the family story. Like, I've experienced my life on earth, which is different from yours and different from Josh's. But when we get together, we realize we're all kind of walking through the same story. And when the church gets together, God said, "Tell my good works to one another." And then that's liturgy. We're continuing that meta narrative, which I'll have to start using that word because it makes me feel smart. But we're sharing that meta narrative when we get together, and we're like, "Oh, God's actually doing the same thing in your life He's doing mine." The circumstances might be different, the situations may be different, but the destination is actually the same. And so that's liturgy, and that's doxology, which one of your questions on the email you sent me is, how does it all relate to theology? Very intimately. It flows from theology. Theology is the academic study of God. We want to get to know Him, just like I want to get to know my wife, just like I wanted to get to know you when you interviewed me for this position nearly 11 years ago, so that, going back to the earlier point, I know how to approach you. I know how to for lack of a better word, please you, and also get what I want, right?
Right.
Right. So it's the same between us and God. But so I got to get to know Him. So I study the Scriptures to get to know, what does He want? What makes Him tick, and what ticks Him off? He went as far as to send Jesus so that we would understand it better.
God in the flesh.
I have a few questions about the definition of liturgy that I wonder if this would be a good place for it. Like, when I see the definition, like a prescribed form or just set of forms for public religious service, like it seems like certainly there's a spectrum there, right? Like,
Sure.
like our minds kind of maybe sometimes go to like the most extreme end of that, the most like where the most rituals happen. And so more like, like high church situations, right? Anglican churches, Eastern Orthodox, the Catholic services. But you could say like right here at Life Fellowship, we have a prescribed kind of form, that our services go. And so I wonder, like, is a lot of the differences on that spectrum basically how formal this is, or how many rituals go in it, or what do you think is like the difference between kind of what we do kind of ritual wise and then like kind of when we think of like some of the more like high church kind of scenarios?
This is one of the things I both like and dislike about you, Josh.
Oh, no.
You lead me to wanting to give the answer that I like the least, which is I don't know. But
I don't know is a perfectly legitimate question.
No, I think it's a very legitimate question. So I
could ask you an easier one. What would it look like for us to be too informal? Like, we know we're not trying to be too super formal here.
Yeah.
So what would too informal? What would be what would it look like if we went too far the other direction on the spectrum here at Life Fellowship?
Well, I think one of the key conditions to the definition that you just quoted about liturgy is the public gathering. So the liturgy tends to root itself in the idea that more than me has gathered into a space for the same objective of pleasing God and hearing from God.
Yeah.
So with that context in mind, then you develop a liturgy.
Yeah.
So, I think we could certainly over-formalize liturgy, and we have. So liturgy has become what Dan explained earlier, kind of cold. You don't relate to it. I went to Hong Kong with my wife years ago, who is originally from Hong Kong, visited church with her, and walked into a worship service in which I was expecting to be stretched. I was expecting to have kind of my brain poked a little bit. And they were singing the same songs that I was singing at Hickory Grove.
Wow.
Here I am in Hong Kong, and we're singing English worship songs with projectors and, all the things. And I thought, man, so that's liturgy
it's more
gone
unifying than
liturgy gone
Thought.
wrong.
Interesting.
Right? Yeah, to me, that's homogenous. That's a flattening.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so, but they adopted a modern American Western approach to God.
You would have preferred to see more diversity there.
Yeah, I wanted to see how was a culture that, I stepped outside of the doors of that church and they're eating foods I've never seen in my life.
But then inside the church,
they were very American and white.
I love that you brought that up because I see this all over the world. And that is what I refer to as spiritual colonialism.
Yes.
Because the West
should trademark that.
Well, I fight it for sure because no matter where I go in the world, I find churches that were started or are led by Western transplants, usually from America. And it is just a poorly done, regionalized replica of what we do here, forced upon a culture that doesn't even understand it.
Wow.
I saw this in Vietnam a lot.
Really?
And so you'd have these 12 or 15 people sitting in a room singing American songs that have been translated into Vietnamese. And honestly, it was just... The service felt dead. The people looked dead. I felt like I was dying inside.
And God probably felt so foreign to them.
Yeah.
Where does the whole God became flesh and dwelt among us find connectivity in that context?
Well, to me, it felt about the same as when I visited some Buddhist temples or Hindu temples in that part of the world, and it seemed strange, it seemed foreign, and yet they seem to be very engaged in it. Yeah. So we've forced this on, but I've got to want, like when you go to Africa and they've got a 4-hour service and they give testimonies and they come forward for the offering and they're dancing and celebrating or what. I don't really feel at home in that, but they do. Yeah. And they're doing that. And I think
but as you're not feeling at home in that, does it, again, this is going to sound like a Harry Potter wicked magic word, but conjure comes to mind. Does it conjure thoughts about other aspects and attributes of God that you would not have had here with us?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's where I think the richness of that experience comes from.
Yeah, and that's why I thoroughly enjoy it because it makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Because I become comfortable in my tradition.
And why am I not relating to God in this way?
Yeah.
God's obviously very real here. There's something about God I've not connected with.
And you experienced it to a far more minor degree when you were growing up because you had grandparents who were Baptists and grandparents who were Pentecostal.
Oh, yeah.
So even within our American mindset and so forth, there are variations. It's like difference between going to Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox. And
ping-ponged between those two liturgies. They had very different liturgies.
Yeah. And so then what we do is we begin thinking, well, the way we do it is the only correct way to do it, the only right way to do it.
Which is kind of the seeding of a cult.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that's why we've exported it to other countries, and that's why we have so many denominational divisions, in that we have fought over style rather than substance in some cases.
You answered Josh's question better. That everything you just said is the root of bad liturgy. Yeah. We think our way it worked for us. It must be right. Let's codify it, and that becomes liturgy, irrelevant liturgy around the world. Well,
and that's why I'm glad we've kind of got to this point in our conversation, and we're going to take a break, and we're going to do a next episode where I want to talk a little bit about the elements that we would find in an order of service or a liturgy, and what makes them distinct, where are they grounded at in Scripture, and what should we be accomplishing in them as we experience them in a format that is pre-designed. And there's, because you grew up Pentecostal, and my Pentecostal friends often really...
Well, I grew up...
if
my Pentecostal family's listening, like, no, I was half and half if you were to
but you grew up more familiar with that than others of us who were forbidden to go
right. Yeah, fair.
But in the end, there's a balance between allowing the spontaneity of a engaging, like this podcast episode did not turn out anything like I think any of us planned it. We didn't really pre-plan it in such a way that, so I'm not really surprised at that. Yeah. And then the next one will be the same thing. We're conversing. Some people love that. And some people say, well, what was the purpose of that? And people do that at church sometimes. Some people say, well, let's just get together and see what God does. And then there are other people who go to the other extreme that if you deviate from it, somehow you've broken it. Where's the balance? How do we determine that? Should there be leadership toward the accomplishment of an ultimate worship objective? So that's kind of where we're going to go in our next episode. Jason, thanks for sharing with you so far. And this has been kind of like, I think it's the appetizer of a great meal that's about to be served. And as always, I just want to say thank you so much for listening to us here at our podcast at Life Talks. And I hope you'll give us some feedback. I got 2 or 3 notes this morning from people who'd listened to. Sometimes they're critical. Sometimes they're thanking. Sometimes they say, hey, why don't you talk about this the next time? Whatever it is, we want the feedback. Give it to us. Share us if you would on social media. Download us if you would from Podbean or Apple iTunes or wherever you get yours, and tell others about us. Until next time, thanks as always for joining us here at Life Talks.